In the fall of 1963, a clerk at the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse discovered a bundle of documents wedged behind a loose panel in the basement archive. The papers had been hidden there for nearly a century, preserved by the dry air and the darkness. Among them was a bill of sale dated October 14, 1859, recording the transfer of 2 enslaved women from the bankrupt estate of Silas Bellamy. The document itself was unremarkable. Thousands of identical bills had been filed across Louisiana during those years. What caught the clerk's attention were the handwritten notes in the margins, written in a different ink, in a different hand, by someone who had clearly returned to the document long after it had been filed. The notes read, "The birthmark behind the left ear, both of them. God help us." The clerk made a photocopy and sent it to the State Historical Society. From there, the story unspooled. It began on a grey October morning in the town of St. Francisville, Louisiana. The year was 1859. The old market square sat 2 blocks east of the river landing, a stone building with iron posts and a wooden platform that had served as an auction block for nearly 3 decades. Silas Bellamy, a cotton planter who had overextended himself on land purchases in the 1850s, had died the previous spring, owing more money than his property was worth. The creditors had been patient for 18 months. Now they wanted their share. The auction had been announced in the Feliciana Democrat, a weekly newspaper that served the parish. The notice listed the property to be sold: 1,200 acres of farmland, 1 grist mill, 23 head of cattle, assorted farming equipment, household furniture, and 17 enslaved workers. The names of the workers were not included in the newspaper notice. They rarely were. By 9 o'clock that morning, a small crowd had gathered in front of the market building. The weather was cool for October, the sky a flat sheet of clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. Men in dark coats stood in clusters, some holding ledgers, others smoking cigars. A few women had come with their husbands, though they remained near the back of the crowd, parasols folded under their arms. The auctioneer, a thin man named Horatio Platt, who had been conducting such sales since the 1830s, positioned himself on the wooden platform and called for order. The workers from the Bellamy estate had been brought to St. Francisville the previous evening and held in a storage room behind the market building. They were brought out one at a time or in family groups and made to stand on the platform while Platt described their skills and their temperaments. A blacksmith named Josiah went first. He was purchased by a plantation owner from West Feliciana Parish for $900. A cook named Celia, along with her 2 young sons, was sold to a household in Natchez. The boys were 9 and 11. They clutched their mother's skirt and did not cry. Then came Ruth. She was a seamstress, 42 years old, described in the estate inventory as skilled with needle and thread, capable of producing clothing for both house and field workers. She walked onto the platform with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, and she did not look at the crowd. Beside her stood her daughter Esther, who had turned 18 just 3 weeks earlier. Esther was tall, with dark hair pulled back from her face and tied with a strip of cloth. Her skin was lighter than her mother's, a detail that Platt did not mention, but that several of the men noticed. Her eyes moved across the crowd once, quickly, and then settled on a point somewhere above their heads, as if she were looking at the clouds. She looked exhausted. All of them did. The clerk who recorded the proceedings that day was a man named Tobias Carney, formerly a bookkeeper for a shipping company in New Orleans, now employed by the parish to document legal transactions. His handwriting was small and precise, and his notes from that day survive in the courthouse basement, still legible after more than 100 years. He wrote that Ruth refused to release Esther's hand, that the auctioneer had to separate them physically, and that Ruth shouted the words "my baby" several times before she was led away. The phrase struck Carney as unusual, he noted, because the daughter was clearly an adult. He wrote the words in his ledger anyway. He wrote everything down. That was his job. The bidding for Ruth was brief. A cloth merchant from Baton Rouge named Malcolm Webb, who owned a dry goods store on 3rd Street and needed a seamstress for his tailoring operation, offered $420. No one countered. Ruth was led to a wagon that had been parked along the side of the market building, and she did not look back at her daughter. According to Carney's notes, she stopped shouting as soon as the auctioneer's gavel came down. She simply went silent and climbed into the wagon, and she did not make another sound. Esther was sold next. The winning bid came from August Harland, a man of 47 years who owned a cotton plantation called Cypress Hollow, located 14 miles southeast of St. Francisville near the Mississippi River. Harland was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick grey beard and the sun-weathered skin of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He paid $550 for Esther, which was a fair price for a young woman with no documented skills beyond basic housework, but the price was not what attracted attention. What attracted attention was the woman standing beside him. Eleanor Harland, August's wife, was 37 years old. She was slender and pale, with dark hair arranged in a neat twist at the back of her head, and she wore a grey travelling dress with a high collar that made her look older than she was. According to Carney, she had not planned to attend the auction. She had come to St. Francisville to visit a dressmaker and had agreed to meet her husband at the market square afterward. She arrived just as Esther was being led onto the platform. The clerk did not record what happened next, but Eleanor's own letters, written years later and preserved by distant relatives in Baton Rouge, described the moment in precise detail. She wrote that she had been standing near the back of the crowd, half listening to the auctioneer's voice, when she saw the young woman step onto the platform. Esther's head was turned slightly to the left, and her hair had slipped forward over her shoulder, exposing the skin behind her ear. The birthmark was dark against her skin, a crescent-shaped patch of pigment about the size of a thumbnail, positioned directly behind the left ear, high on the neck. Eleanor saw it and felt her stomach drop. She had a birthmark in exactly the same place, the same shape, the same size, the same dark crescent behind the left ear. For a long moment, Eleanor did not move. She stood at the back of the crowd, her hand pressed against her stomach, while the bidding continued. She watched August raise his hand. She watched the auctioneer point at him. She watched the gavel come down. She did not say anything. She told no one what she had seen. That evening, August Harland returned to Cypress Hollow with Esther in the back of his wagon. The plantation house was a large, two-story structure built in the Greek Revival style, with white columns and a wide front porch. It had been constructed in 1832 by August's father, a Virginia planter named Theodore Harland, who had moved his family to Louisiana after the War of 1812. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees, and the cotton fields stretched behind it for nearly a mile, sloping down toward a bend in the river. Eleanor had arrived home an hour earlier. She was waiting on the porch when the wagon pulled up. She watched her husband climb down and gesture for Esther to follow. She watched the young woman step onto the gravel drive and look up at the house with an expression that revealed nothing. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch. "I want her in the main house," she said. August stopped. He looked at his wife, then at the young woman standing beside the wagon, then back at his wife. "What for?" "Sewing. I need a seamstress. The summer dresses need to be let out, and there is more mending than I can manage alone." August frowned. "There is a cabin ready for her in the quarter. She can sew there as well as anywhere else. The light is better in the house, and I need her close. I will not walk to the quarter every time a stitch comes loose." The argument continued for several minutes, but Eleanor prevailed. She always did. August had learned. over 17 years of marriage, that his wife's stubbornness was a force of nature as immovable as the river itself. He relented, and Esther was given a small room on the ground floor of the main house, next to the kitchen, with a window that faced the garden. The decision caused talk. The household staff, most of them enslaved workers who had been at Cypress Hollow for years, exchanged glances in the kitchen and whispered in the corridors. The overseer, a man named Carson, asked August directly whether there was something about the new girl he ought to know. August told him to mind his own business. Carson did not ask again. What no one understood, and what Eleanor refused to explain, was the nature of her interest in Esther. She did not speak to the young woman beyond the necessary instructions about sewing work. She did not spend long hours in her company, or invite her to sit in the parlor, or treat her with any visible favoritism. But she watched her, constantly. From the window of her upstairs bedroom, she watched Esther walk across the garden. From the doorway of the kitchen, she watched Esther sew. From the end of the corridor, she watched Esther eat her meals alone in the small ground floor room, the door half open, the light from the window falling across her hands. Eleanor was looking for the birthmark. Every time she saw Esther, she looked for it, and every time she found it, the same dark crescent behind the same left ear, her chest tightened with a dread she could not name and could not ignore. The first few weeks passed in this strange, suspended tension. Esther did her work. Eleanor watched. August noticed that his wife had become withdrawn, distracted, but he attributed it to the change in weather or some passing female complaint. He did not ask questions. Husbands of Eleanor's class rarely did. Sometime in November, Eleanor began making inquiries. She wrote letters to people she had not contacted in years, asking questions that must have seemed strange to anyone who received them. She wrote to a former overseer of the Bellamy estate, a man named Thibodeau, who had retired to a boarding house in Baton Rouge, and asked whether he remembered a woman named Ruth and her daughter Esther. She wrote to the parish clerk's office in St. Francisville and requested copies of any birth records for enslaved children born on the Bellamy property in 1840 and 1841. She wrote to a retired physician in New Orleans named Dr. Lucien Moreau, who had attended her mother during a long illness many years earlier, and asked whether he recalled anything unusual about the year of Margaret Dupre's confinement. The responses came slowly. The overseer Thibodeau sent back a brief, barely literate note stating that he remembered Ruth as a seamstress who had arrived at the Bellamy plantation sometime in the spring of 1841, carrying an infant. He did not remember the exact month, and he did not know who the father was. The parish clerk sent copies of two documents that seemed to contradict each other. The first was an entry in the Bellamy plantation birth register, noting that Esther had been born in March of 1841 to a woman named Ruth. The second was a baptismal record from a small Catholic church near the plantation, dated August of 1840, listing the baptism of an infant named Esther, daughter of Ruth. The field for the father's name had been scratched out. Eleanor stared at the baptismal record for a long time. If the document was accurate, Esther was a year older than the plantation register claimed. The discrepancy might have been a simple error, a careless plantation clerk recording the wrong date. But the scratched-out name suggested something more deliberate. Someone had wanted to hide the identity of Esther's father. The letter from Dr. Moreau arrived in early December. It was the longest of the three responses, written in a shaky hand on yellowed stationery from a medical practice that no longer existed. Moreau recalled Margaret Dupre, Eleanor's mother, quite well. He had attended her during the summer and autumn of 1841, when she had been confined to a private residence in St. Charles Parish, ostensibly recovering from a nervous condition. Moreau wrote that the illness had been sudden and severe, that Margaret had been removed from society with considerable haste, and that the entire affair had been managed with unusual secrecy. He had been paid well for his discretion. Moreau also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a servant had accompanied Margaret during the confinement, a young woman named Ruth. She had been sent to the same house at the same time, for reasons that Moreau had never been told. He had seen her occasionally, coming and going from the kitchen, always with the same expression of wary watchfulness. After several months, both women returned to the Dupré household. Margaret came back without the baby that some of the household staff claimed they had seen her holding during the confinement. Ruth came back with a newborn. Eleanor read this letter 3 times, then she read it again. Her hands were shaking by the time she folded the paper and slid it into the drawer of her writing desk. The implications were clear enough, even if the details remained obscure. Her mother, Margaret Dupré, had given birth to a child in secrecy during the summer of 1841. That child had disappeared from the record. At the same time, a servant named Ruth had appeared with a newborn daughter, a girl named Esther, whose birth records were inconsistent and whose father's identity had been deliberately erased. Eleanor, too, had been born during that same period. Her own birth was recorded as having occurred on June 19, 1841, at the Dupré family residence in New Orleans. But her mother had been confined elsewhere during that time. The dates did not add up. The first hypothesis Eleanor formed was that Esther was her half-sister, the product of an affair between her mother and an unknown man, hidden away to protect the family's reputation. It would explain the birthmark, the secrecy, and the strange convergence of dates. It would also explain why her mother, before her death in 1850, had several times inquired about the welfare of a servant named Ruth, with an intensity that Eleanor had found puzzling at the time. But as the winter deepened and Eleanor continued her investigation, the picture grew darker. The next step in Eleanor's investigation came through a retired lawyer in New Orleans named Francis Girard. Girard had handled legal matters for the Dupré family for nearly 40 years, and he was one of the few people still alive who had direct knowledge of the family's private affairs. He was also, by 1859, very old, nearly blind, and inclined to talk more freely than he would have done in his professional prime. Eleanor arranged to visit him during a trip to New Orleans in January of 1860, telling her husband that she was going to purchase fabric for the spring wardrobe. Girard received her in his study, a cluttered room on the second floor of a house on Chartres Street, filled with books and papers and the smell of old tobacco. He was cordial but cautious. He remembered Eleanor as a child, he said, and he remembered her mother with great respect. When Eleanor asked about the events of 1841, his expression changed. He sat back in his chair and studied her with clouded eyes. "Why would you want to dig up those old bones?" he asked. Eleanor did not tell him about Esther. She said only that she had been going through her mother's papers and had found some irregularities that troubled her. She wanted to understand the family's history before she died. Girard considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if he had been expecting this conversation for years, and began to talk. The story he told was fragmentary and incomplete. Pieced together from half-remembered conversations and documents, he admitted he had been instructed to destroy, but had not. The Dupré family, Girard explained, had been wealthy and socially prominent, with extensive landholdings in St. Charles Parish and a reputation to protect. In the spring of 1841, Margaret Dupré had become pregnant. The pregnancy had been difficult, both physically and socially. Girard would not say why, but he implied that the circumstances of the conception had been irregular, possibly scandalous. Margaret had been sent to a secluded house in St. Charles Parish, accompanied by a servant named Ruth and attended by Dr. Moreau. The official story, circulated among the family's acquaintances, was that she was suffering from a nervous disorder and required complete rest. In fact, she was waiting to give birth. What happened next was less clear. Girard said that Margaret had given birth to a daughter, but that she had been so unwell afterward, so profoundly disoriented, that she could not care for the infant. Around the same time, a young woman named Lydia, a servant on the Dupré property, had also given birth to a daughter, and she too had fallen gravely ill. Lydia died of a fever within weeks of the delivery. Her child survived. The household was left with 2 infant girls, both healthy, both female, both born within days of each other, and no one could say with certainty which child belonged to which mother. Etienne Dupré, Eleanor's father, had made a decision. He had chosen one of the infants to be raised as his legitimate daughter, as Eleanor. The other infant had been given to Ruth, the servant who had accompanied Margaret during the confinement and registered as Ruth's own child. The birthmark, the dark crescent behind the ear, had appeared on both infants. Girard did not know whether this meant they were twins, or whether it was simply a coincidence, or whether the story of Lydia was a fabrication designed to cover an even more uncomfortable truth: that both children had been born to Margaret, and that Etienne had simply decided which one would inherit the Dupré name. Girard showed Eleanor a fragment of a letter. It was dated August of 1841, written in her father's hand, addressed to a man whose name had been torn away. The surviving text read, "The girls will never know which one remained with the true mother. It is better this way." Eleanor asked whether anyone alive knew the truth. Girard said that Ruth knew, or claimed to know, but Ruth had been sold to the Bellamy estate after Margaret's death in 1850, and she had taken her daughter, Esther, with her. No one had heard from her since. Eleanor returned to Cypress Hollow with the letter fragment hidden in her luggage, along with a stack of documents that Girard had reluctantly allowed her to take. She told no one what she had learned. For the next several weeks, she continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She supervised the household, she attended church, she wrote letters. She watched Esther sew. But the watching had changed. Before, Eleanor had observed Esther with a mixture of curiosity and unease, studying the young woman as one might study an unfamiliar animal. Now she observed her with a desperate intensity, searching for signs of resemblance, for evidence that might confirm or deny what the documents suggested. She studied the shape of Esther's hands, the angle of her jaw, the way she held her head when she was thinking. She compared these details to her own reflection in the mirror, to the faded daguerreotypes of her mother, to the portrait of her father that hung in the parlor. The more she looked, the more uncertain she became. The resemblances shifted depending on the light. Some days she was certain that Esther was her sister. Other days she was certain that Esther was herself. The thought that troubled her most was this: if the 2 infants had been identical, if no one could tell them apart, then Etienne Dupré's choice had been arbitrary. He had simply picked one of the babies and declared her to be Eleanor. The other had been given to Ruth and consigned to a life of enslavement, which meant that Eleanor's entire identity, her name, her inheritance, her freedom, her marriage, her position in society, rested on nothing more solid than a coin toss performed by a dead man nearly 2 decades earlier. She began to avoid mirrors. The investigation could not remain secret forever. In February of 1860, Auguste Harlan discovered that his wife had been corresponding with a lawyer in New Orleans. He found a letter from Girard, left carelessly on Eleanor's writing desk, and he read it. The contents alarmed him. He called Eleanor into his study and demanded an explanation. Eleanor did not tell him the full truth. She said only that she had discovered a family connection to the servant Esther and that she was attempting to determine the extent of the relationship. Auguste's response was immediate and practical. He did not care about family connections or birthmarks or the secrets of the Dupré household. He cared about property. If Esther was discovered to have a legitimate claim to the Dupré estate, a portion of which remained tied up in legal proceedings following Etienne Dupré's death in 1853, then Auguste stood to lose money. Significant money. He ordered Eleanor to cease her investigation immediately and to turn over all the documents she had collected. Eleanor refused. The marriage had been strained for years before this confrontation. Auguste was a practical man, a businessman, and he had married Eleanor in 1842 for reasons that had more to do with property consolidation than affection. Eleanor had been a dutiful wife, but she had never been a warm one. The Birthmark incident and the secrets it had unearthed had driven a permanent wedge between them. Auguste could not understand why his wife was obsessed with a servant's parentage. Eleanor could not forgive her husband for treating the matter as a financial inconvenience rather than a moral catastrophe. The standoff lasted for several days. Auguste threatened to destroy the documents. Eleanor threatened to leave him. The household staff moved through the corridors with unusual quietness, aware of the tension between the master and mistress, frightened of being drawn into it. In the end, Auguste backed down. He did not understand his wife's obsession, but he recognized that she was prepared to burn down her entire life over it. She had that Dupré stubbornness, that refusal to yield. He retreated to the cotton fields and left her to her madness. Eleanor resumed her investigation with renewed determination. She wrote to Malcolm Webb, the cloth merchant in Baton Rouge, who had purchased Ruth at the St. Francisville auction. She did not explain why she wanted to contact the woman, only that it was a matter of personal importance. Webb, after some hesitation, agreed to arrange a meeting. The meeting took place in March of 1860, in a small back room behind Webb's store on 3rd Street. The room was used for storing bolts of fabric and sewing supplies, and it smelled of dust and cotton and old wood. Eleanor arrived alone, having traveled to Baton Rouge on the pretext of visiting a distant cousin. She wore a plain dress and a dark bonnet that concealed most of her face. She did not want to be recognized. Ruth was waiting for her, seated on a wooden crate beside a stack of muslin. She was not the same woman Eleanor had seen at the auction 6 months earlier. Her hair had gone completely grey. Her face was thinner, the bones more prominent. She looked like a person who had been hollowed out from the inside. She did not stand when Eleanor entered. She simply looked up with the same flat, watchful expression that Dr. Moreau had described in his letter. And she waited. Esther was there too. Eleanor had arranged for her to travel from Cypress Hollow, telling Auguste that she needed the seamstress to help select fabric. It was the first time Esther had seen her mother since the day of the auction, and the reunion was quiet, almost wordless. The two women embraced without speaking, and then they both turned to face Eleanor, united in their suspicion and their fear. Eleanor did not waste time with pleasantries. She produced the documents, the contradictory birth records, the letter from Dr. Moreau, the legal notes from Francis Girard, the fragment of her father's handwriting. She laid them out on a crate, one by one, and she explained what she had discovered. She spoke in a low, steady voice, the same voice she used when giving instructions to servants or reading aloud from the Bible. She told Ruth what she believed to be true, that she and Esther had been born within days of each other, that one of them was Margaret Dupré's daughter, and the other was the child of a woman named Lydia, that no one could say which was which, and that Etienne Dupré had covered up the entire affair to protect his family's reputation. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, there was a long silence. Then Ruth spoke. The story she told was different from the version Eleanor had constructed. Not completely different, but different enough to change everything. Ruth said that she had been brought to the Dupré household as a teenager, purchased from an estate sale in 1830. She had worked in the kitchen and the laundry, and eventually she had been assigned to attend Margaret Dupre, who had taken a liking to her. Ruth described Margaret as a woman of uncommon intelligence, and even more uncommon sadness. Trapped in a marriage to a man who viewed her as an asset rather than a partner, Etienne Dupre was, by Ruth's account, a cold and calculating man who treated everyone around him as instruments to be used and discarded. In the winter of 1840, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Margaret was often ill, confined to her bed for weeks at a time, and Dr. Moreau visited the house with increasing frequency. In the spring of 1841, Etienne announced that Margaret would be moving to a private residence in St. Charles Parish for the remainder of her pregnancy, officially to recover her health in a quieter environment. Ruth was sent with her. The house in St. Charles Parish was a small, secluded property on the banks of the Mississippi, surrounded by cypress trees and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. Margaret and Ruth lived there alone, with Dr. Moreau visiting every few weeks to monitor Margaret's condition. The birth occurred in late June, during a thunderstorm that knocked out the only bridge connecting the property to the main road. Ruth insisted, and maintained for the rest of her life, that Margaret gave birth to twin daughters. Both girls were healthy. Both had the same dark crescent-shaped birthmark behind the left ear. Ruth was present at the birth, along with Dr. Moreau and a midwife from a nearby town. She saw both infants emerge. She held both of them. She watched the midwife clean them and wrap them in cloth. The story of Lydia, Ruth said, was a lie. Lydia was a real person, a young servant who had worked in the Dupre household, but she had never been pregnant. She had died of a fever in 1841, and Etienne Dupre had simply appropriated her name to construct a plausible narrative. The fiction of two mothers made it easier to explain why two identical infant girls had appeared in the household at the same time. It also made it easier to separate them, to assign one to freedom and the other to bondage, without anyone asking too many questions. Margaret, according to Ruth, had not been ill after the birth in the way Dr. Moreau had described. She had been devastated. She had wanted to keep both children, but Etienne had insisted that only one could be acknowledged as a legitimate Dupre. Margaret had fought him. She had threatened to expose the truth. She had refused to choose between her daughters. In the end, Etienne had simply taken one of the infants and given her to Ruth, instructing her to claim the child as her own. Margaret had returned to New Orleans with the other child, the one who would become Eleanor. She had never forgiven her husband. She had never recovered from the loss. Ruth added one more detail that Eleanor had not expected. Shortly before Margaret's death in 1850, she had summoned Ruth to her bedside and confessed that she did not know which of the two daughters she had raised. The infants had been identical. They had been separated immediately after birth. Ruth had been the only person who saw both of them together, and even she, in the chaos of that night, in the darkness of the storm, had not been able to mark which one came out first, which one was wrapped in which blanket, which one was placed in which woman's arms. Margaret had spent 9 years raising a child who might or might not have been her biological daughter. She had then spent the remaining years of her marriage trying to arrange for the other child, the one given to Ruth, to be brought back into the household. Etienne had blocked every attempt. He had sold Ruth and Esther to the Bellamy plantation to remove them from his wife's reach. Margaret Dupre died not knowing which of her daughters she had kept and which she had given away. The room behind the dry goods store fell silent. Eleanor sat motionless on her crate, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. Esther, who had been standing near the door, moved closer to her mother. She did not look at Eleanor. She did not look at anyone. The question that hung in the air, unspoken, was the same question Eleanor had been asking herself since her investigation began. Which one of them was the daughter of Margaret Dupre? Which one had been born free and which one had been born enslaved? Which one was the legitimate heir, and which one was the impostor? Ruth said she did not know. She had tried to remember for 18 years which blanket she had used, which infant she had carried from the birthing room, but the memory would not solidify. The storm had been so loud, the room had been so dark, the midwife had handed her a baby, and she had taken it, and that was all she could recall with certainty. The documents could not answer the question either. Etienne Dupré had destroyed or altered every record that might have established the true sequence of events. The contradictory birth records that Eleanor had discovered were not errors. They were deliberate interference designed to make it impossible for anyone to reconstruct the truth. Eleanor and Esther stared at each other across the dim room. Two women, the same age, the same birthmark, the same mother, the same father, separated by a decision made by a man who had been dead for 7 years, facing each other for the first time not as mistress and servant, but as something else entirely. Something for which there was no word in the language of that time or that place. The silence was broken by a sound from the front of the store. Malcolm Webb was calling for Ruth. "Business," he said. "Customers." The cloth had arrived from New Orleans and needed to be inventoried before nightfall. Ruth rose from her crate, her joints cracking, and began to gather the documents that Eleanor had spread across the makeshift table. She handled the papers with surprising gentleness, as if they were fragile things, as if they might dissolve at the slightest touch. Eleanor told Esther and Ruth that she would arrange for their freedom. She had already begun the process, she said. She had sold some jewelry, a pearl necklace, and a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to her mother, and she had hired a lawyer in New Orleans who specialized in manumission cases. The legal process would take time, and it would have to be handled carefully to avoid alerting August or anyone else who might have a financial interest in keeping Esther enslaved. But Eleanor was confident it could be done. Ruth listened to this promise without visible emotion. She had heard promises before, from Margaret Dupré, from other women, from men who claimed to have influence. None of them had been kept. She folded the documents and tucked them into the pocket of her dress, and she told Eleanor that she would believe it when she saw the papers signed and sealed. Then she walked out of the back room and returned to her work. Esther remained behind for a moment. She stood near the door, her hand on the frame, her back to Eleanor. "You want to know which one of us is the real Dupré," she said, without turning around. "You want to know if you are the mistress or the servant, if I am the free woman or the slave, but those are his words. Your father's words. He is the one who made the categories. He is the one who decided that one of us would be one thing and the other would be the other. The truth is simpler than you think. We are both his daughters. That is the only fact that matters. Everything else is just papers." She left before Eleanor could respond. The next few months were difficult. The legal process of manumission in Louisiana was complicated and expensive, and it required the consent of the owner, which in this case was August Harland. Eleanor did not ask for his consent. She did not tell him what she was doing. She used the lawyer in New Orleans, a man named Dupont, to file documents that granted conditional freedom to Esther, citing a debt that August owed to Eleanor's family estate, a debt that Eleanor claimed the right to collect in the form of Esther's manumission. The legal maneuvering was creative and ethically questionable, and August, when he eventually discovered it, was furious. But by then, the papers had been filed and the witnesses had been paid, and there was nothing he could do without exposing himself to a lawsuit that would have cost more than Esther was worth. Ruth's freedom was arranged separately. Eleanor purchased her outright from Malcolm Webb, using money from the sale of her remaining jewelry, and then signed the manumission papers in the presence of 2 witnesses at the Baton Rouge courthouse. The transaction was recorded in the parish register on September 3, 1860, along with a note explaining that the manumission was a private matter between parties and that no further details would be provided. The Civil War began 7 months later. Louisiana seceded from the Union in January of 1861, and by April the state was at war. Cypress Hollow survived the conflict relatively intact, though August Harland died of dysentery in 1863, leaving Eleanor as the sole owner of the property. She did not remarry. She had no children. She spent the remainder of the war years quietly managing the plantation with the help of a hired overseer, waiting for the conflict to end. After the war, Eleanor sold Cypress Hollow and moved to New Orleans, where she purchased a small house on Esplanade Avenue. She lived alone, with a single servant, and she rarely received visitors. Her neighbors described her as a quiet, dignified woman who kept to herself and asked no favors of anyone. They did not know about Esther. They did not know about Ruth. They did not know about the birthmark. Esther, meanwhile, had established herself as a seamstress in New Orleans, operating a small workshop on Rampart Street that employed 3 women and produced clothing for the city's middle-class families. She was known for her precise stitching and her ability to copy the latest European fashions from sketches and descriptions. Her business was successful enough that she was able to purchase the building where she worked, a narrow 2-story structure with a shop on the ground floor and living quarters above. Eleanor and Esther never publicly acknowledged their relationship. In the social world of post-war New Orleans, a white woman of the planter class could not openly associate with a colored seamstress, no matter what family connection might exist between them. But the documentary record tells a different story. Property records from the late 1860s and early 1870s show Eleanor Harland and Esther appearing together in a series of legal transactions: a joint purchase of land on Esplanade Avenue, a shared investment in a shipping company, a co-signed lease for a warehouse in the Lower Garden District. Their names appear side by side, over and over, in careful legal script, as if the lawyers who drafted the documents understood that the 2 women were more than business partners, but lacked the vocabulary to describe what they actually were. Ruth lived with Esther in the apartment above the workshop on Rampart Street. She continued to work as a seamstress well into her old age, her fingers never losing their skill, her eyes never losing their sharpness. She died in 1878, at the age of 61, of a respiratory infection that had lingered through the winter. Esther buried her in a small cemetery outside the city, in a plot that she had purchased several years earlier. The tombstone bore a simple inscription: Ruth, beloved mother. No surname, no dates, just those 3 words carved into stone, sufficient for anyone who needed to know. The last document in the case is a statement written by Eleanor Harland in 1887. She was 70 years old by then, living in the house on Esplanade Avenue, her health failing, her mind still sharp. The statement was written in her own hand, on 3 sheets of paper, and it was addressed to no one in particular. It reads, in part, "For 30 years I have asked myself which of us was born to Margaret Dupré and which was born to the servant Lydia. I have examined every document, interrogated every witness, compared every detail of our faces and our hands and our habits. I have never found the answer. I do not believe the answer exists. The question itself is a trap, constructed by the men who created the records and who benefited from the confusion." Etienne Dupré decided that one of his daughters would be free and the other would be enslaved. He did not care which was which. The categories were arbitrary. The birthmark proved that we shared the same blood, but it could not tell us what that blood meant in the eyes of the law. I have come to understand that the law was never designed to answer such questions. The law was designed to maintain the fiction that some people are born to own and others are born to be owned. The rest is silence and paperwork. Below this text, Esther added a single sentence, in a different hand, in a different ink. The family knew the truth from the beginning. What no one knew was which lie would survive the longest. That was the last entry in the file. After Eleanor's death in 1890, the documents passed into the possession of a niece, who stored them in a trunk in her attic, where they remained undisturbed for 7 decades. The trunk was discovered in 1962, during the renovation of a house in Baton Rouge's Garden District. The contractor who found it, a man named Joseph Cormier, turned the documents over to a local historian who recognized their significance and submitted them to the state archives. A microfilm copy was made in 1964. The originals were stored in a climate-controlled vault in Baton Rouge, where they remain to this day, catalogued under the heading Harlan Dupré Family Papers, 1841 to 1890. The microfilm is available for public viewing. The birthmark is mentioned in 3 separate documents: the margin note in the auction ledger, a letter from Eleanor to Dr. Moreau dated December of 1859, and a brief passage in Ruth's manumission papers, where the crescent-shaped mark is listed among Esther's identifying physical characteristics. The original documents are fragile and yellowed, and the handwriting is sometimes difficult to read, but the story they tell is unmistakable. In the summer of 1968, a graduate student from Tulane University named Margaret Weiss attempted to research the case for her doctoral dissertation on racial passing in antebellum Louisiana. She spent 3 months in the state archives, photographing documents and transcribing letters. Her work was interrupted when the archive suffered water damage from a broken pipe, and the Harlan Dupré papers were temporarily removed from circulation for restoration. Weiss submitted a preliminary draft of her dissertation in the fall of 1968, but the full manuscript was never completed. She left the university in 1969 without filing her final thesis, and her research materials were donated to the Tulane Library, where they were misfiled and effectively lost. Another researcher, a sociologist from the University of Mississippi named Dr. Harold Cross, attempted to locate descendants of the Harlan and Dupré families in 1965, hoping to conduct interviews about the case. He found several living relatives, but none of them were willing to speak on the record. One great-grandson of August Harlan's brother, a retired judge living in Shreveport, agreed to a brief telephone conversation, but terminated it abruptly when Cross mentioned Esther's name. The judge said only that the family had put that business behind them and that he saw no benefit in resurrecting old scandals. The house at Cypress Hollow no longer exists. It burned down in 1923, and the land was sold to a timber company that planted the fields with pine trees. The stone foundation remains visible in some places, overgrown with kudzu, sinking slowly into the Louisiana soil. Local teenagers occasionally visit the site after dark, telling each other stories about the ghost of a woman who walks through the ruins, searching for something she lost long ago. They do not know the woman's name. They do not know what she's looking for. They make up stories to fill the silence, the way people always do. The workshop on Rampart Street survived for longer. Esther's clothing business continued to operate after her death, managed by a succession of relatives and employees. The building changed hands several times during the 20th century, serving variously as a tailor's shop, a printing press, a jazz club, and a Vietnamese restaurant. The current owner, a real estate developer who purchased the property in 1963, has stated his intention to demolish the building and construct a parking lot. As of this writing, the demolition has been delayed by a series of bureaucratic disputes involving historic preservation ordinances. The building still stands, though its windows are boarded up and its walls are covered with graffiti. In the basement of the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, in the same archive where the bundle of documents was discovered behind the loose panel, there is a filing cabinet that contains the original death certificates for Eleanor Harlan and Esther. The certificates are stored in separate drawers, filed under different surnames, separated by an alphabetical divide that reflects the logic of the 19th century legal system. Eleanor died on March 14, 1890, at her home on Esplanade Avenue. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. Esther died on April 2, 1904, in the same house on Esplanade Avenue. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. In the space on Esther's certificate marked "Relationship to Informant," someone had written a single word in pencil. The word was "sister." The handwriting matches no other document in the file. The woman who discovered the bundle of documents behind the loose panel in 1963 was a clerk named Dorothy Mitchell. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate of Southern University, and she had been working at the courthouse for less than a year. She found the bundle while searching for land records related to a property dispute in St. Francisville. The panel was loose because the building had settled unevenly over the decades, and the wood had warped, and no one had ever bothered to repair it. Mitchell pulled the panel back, shone a flashlight into the cavity, and saw a stack of papers tied with string, coated in a century of dust. She untied the string and began to read. She read for the rest of the afternoon, sitting on the cold basement floor. Her flashlight balanced on a stack of old ledgers. She read about the auction, about the birthmark, about the hidden pregnancy, about the 2 infants and the storm, and the choice that Etienne Dupré had made. She read Eleanor's final statement and Esther's single sentence below it. She read until the light began to fail, and then she gathered the documents and carried them upstairs to her supervisor. The supervisor, a middle-aged white man named Clarence Fontenot, examined the documents with visible discomfort. He asked Mitchell where she had found them. She told him. He asked whether anyone else had seen them. She said no. He nodded slowly, placed the documents in a manila envelope, and told Mitchell to file the envelope in the archive's restricted section, which required special permission to access. He said it was a matter of privacy. He said the families involved might still have living descendants who would not appreciate having their ancestors' secrets exposed to public scrutiny. Mitchell filed the envelope as instructed, but she kept the photocopy. She had made it in the basement before she brought the originals upstairs using the courthouse's photocopier, which was a bulky machine that produced copies on slick, chemical-scented paper. She folded the photocopy and put it in her purse, and she carried it home that evening, and she stored it in a shoebox in her closet for the next 20 years. She did not tell anyone about it. She did not show it to her husband or her children. She took it out occasionally, late at night when her family was asleep, and she read the margin note over and over again. The birthmark behind the left ear. Both of them. God help us. In 1983, Dorothy Mitchell retired from the courthouse after 20 years of service. At her retirement party, a small gathering in the basement break room, one of her colleagues asked her what case had been the most memorable of her career. Mitchell thought for a moment. Then she said that she had once found a bundle of papers from before the Civil War, hidden behind a wall in the archive, that told a story she had never been able to forget. She did not provide details. She said only that the story involved 2 sisters, a birthmark, and a lie that had outlasted everyone who believed it. The colleague, a young records technician named David Park, asked whether the documents were still in the archive. Mitchell said they were, in the restricted section, inside a manila envelope marked Harlan Dupré Family Papers. Park wrote the name down in his notebook. He never followed up on the lead, and he lost the notebook during a move 3 years later. The original documents remain in the restricted section to this day. The microfilm copy, however, is available to any researcher who requests it. The request form requires a name, an institutional affiliation, and a brief description of the research purpose. Most of the people who request the microfilm are graduate students or amateur genealogists, and most of them come away from the documents with more questions than answers. The story resists tidy conclusions. It does not offer moral clarity or emotional catharsis. It offers only a series of facts, arranged in chronological order, connected by the thinnest of threads. One of those facts is this. In the summer of 1841, in a small house on the banks of the Mississippi River, during a thunderstorm that washed out the only bridge connecting the property to the main road, 2 infant girls were born. They had the same birthmark behind the same ear. They cried at the same pitch. They reached for the same hands. No one could tell them apart. Another fact is this. One of the girls grew up to be Eleanor Harland, and the other grew up to be Esther, and they spent their entire adult lives trying to determine which of them was which. They never found out. The answer died with Etienne Dupré, if he ever knew it. The answer died with the midwife, who disappeared from the documentary record after 1841. The answer died with Dr. Moreau, who took whatever he knew to his grave in 1870. The only person who might have known, the only person who had been present at the birth and survived long enough to be questioned, was Ruth, and Ruth could not remember. The final fact is this. The question of which woman was born free and which was born enslaved was never answered, because it was never answerable. The categories were arbitrary constructions, imposed by a legal system that treated some human beings as property and others as persons, and the boundaries between those categories were maintained by paperwork, by violence, and by the collective refusal to acknowledge what everyone already knew. Eleanor understood this. Esther understood it too. The family knew the truth from the beginning. What no one knew was which lie would survive the longest. In the fall of 1963, a few weeks after Dorothy Mitchell discovered the bundle of documents behind the loose panel, a man named Thomas Harland was cleaning out his mother's attic in Baton Rouge. His mother had died the previous spring, and the house was being sold, and Thomas had been tasked with clearing out the accumulated belongings of 3 generations. In a steamer trunk, wedged beneath the eaves, beneath a stack of mildewed quilts and a box of tarnished silverware, he found a small jewelry case. Inside the case was a daguerreotype, wrapped in silk, sealed in a tin frame that had protected it from the humidity. The daguerreotype showed 2 women standing side by side in a garden. They were both old, in their 60s or 70s, dressed in dark clothes that marked them as women of the 19th century. One of them was white, the other was colored. They were holding hands. Thomas Harland did not recognize either woman. He turned the daguerreotype over and found an inscription on the back. Written in a trembling hand, the ink faded but still legible. Eleanor and Esther, New Orleans, 1888. He did not know who they were. He did not know why his mother had kept the photograph. He placed the daguerreotype back in the jewelry case, closed the lid, and set it aside with the other items he intended to keep. He did not think about it again for the rest of his life. The jewelry case is now in the possession of Thomas Harland's daughter, a woman named Susan, who lives in Houston, Texas. She keeps it in a drawer in her bedroom, wrapped in the same silk her great-grandmother used, and she takes it out occasionally when she cannot sleep. She does not know the full story. She knows only that the women in the photograph were relatives, and that something terrible happened to them a long time ago, and that someone in the family tried to hide it. She has thought about bringing the daguerreotype to a historian, or donating it to a museum, or simply throwing it away. She has not done any of these things. She keeps it in the drawer, wrapped in silk, and she tells herself that someday she will find the courage to learn the truth. The truth is in the documents. The documents are in the archive. The archive is in Baton Rouge, in the basement of the courthouse, behind a door that requires a keycard to open. The room is climate-controlled and well-lit, and the shelves are lined with boxes and binders and manila envelopes. Somewhere among them, filed under Harlan Dupre family papers, 1841 to 1890, is a bundle of documents tied with string, coated in a century of dust, waiting for the next person to find them and read them. The birthmark is mentioned on 3 of those documents, the crescent behind the left ear, the mark that proved the 2 women shared the same blood, the detail that a clerk named Tobias Carney recorded in his ledger in October of 1859, alongside the words "my baby" and the price of $550. Carney died in 1871 at the age of 64 of a stroke that killed him instantly while he was walking home from the courthouse. His ledgers were donated to the state archives by his widow, who had no use for them and no understanding of what they contained. They filled 3 boxes, and they covered a period of 22 years, and they recorded thousands of transactions that no one would ever read, except one. One transaction, on 1 page, in 1 ledger, attracted the attention of a clerk named Dorothy Mitchell, who was looking for land records and found a bundle of papers behind a loose panel instead. And because she found it, and because she read it, and because she made a photocopy and carried it home in her purse, the story survived. It survived the fire at Cypress Hollow. It survived the demolition that threatens the workshop on Rampart Street. It survived the water damage in the archive and the misfiling at the Tulane Library, and the telephone call that ended abruptly when the retired judge realized what the researcher was asking about. It survived everything that was done to bury it. The story is not complete. It will never be complete. The gaps in the record are too wide, and the witnesses are all dead, and the documents that might have answered the central question were destroyed or altered or simply never created. The truth of what happened in that house on the river during the storm in June of 1841 is lost forever. All that remains is what the living chose to record, and what the living chose to preserve, and what the living chose to forget. Eleanor and Esther are buried in separate cemeteries in New Orleans. Eleanor lies in the Dupre family tomb, a marble structure in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, alongside her parents and her grandparents and a dozen other relatives whose names have been worn smooth by the rain. Esther lies in a smaller cemetery in the Treme neighborhood, in a plot she purchased herself, beneath a stone that bears her name and her dates, and nothing else. The 2 graves are 3 miles apart. It takes 20 minutes to drive between them in moderate traffic. It takes an hour to walk. No one visits Eleanor's grave anymore. The Dupre tomb has not been maintained in decades, and the marble is cracked and stained, and the iron gate is rusted shut. The name Dupre is still visible above the door, but the individual names are illegible, eroded by more than a century of exposure to the Louisiana weather. Visitors to St. Louis Cemetery. No. 1 pass the tomb without stopping, on their way to the more famous graves, the voodoo queens and the jazz musicians and the Confederate generals. They do not know that a woman named Eleanor is buried inside, or that she spent her life trying to answer a question that her father had made impossible to answer, or that she died without knowing her own name. Esther's grave is visited occasionally, by descendants of the women who worked in her sewing workshop, by local historians who know the story, by curious strangers who have read the documents or heard the rumors. The tombstone is small and simple, and the inscription is plain, and there is nothing to indicate that the woman buried beneath it was the daughter of a wealthy planter, or the sister of a woman who owned a plantation, or the subject of a secret that lasted for more than a century. The birthmark does not appear on the tombstone. It does not need to.